Hi, I'm Nawaaz Ahmed, the author of the recently released novel Radiant Fugitives. I'm thrilled to be here today to chat with Jafreen Uddin, Executive Director of the Asian American Writers Workshop, where I get to ask her questions about the institution she leads that has been like a beacon to me during the decade I was working on my novel. Jafreen, this is such a pleasure to have this opportunity.
Thank you, Nawaz, for doing this. I'm so excited to chat.
Yeah, I thought I would start by asking one of my favorite questions, which is what brought you here? I'm always intrigued by the paths that bring someone to where they are. You have worked in such a varied and illustrious institutions before you joined AAWW as executive director. And you also are involved in a large number of different literary and social justice organizations. Seems to me that helming AAWW is a natural and logical coming together of the various strands of your career and volunteering. How do you see it yourself?
That's such a great question. I love that question. For me, I've always been a reader. So, kind of first and foremost, um, if anybody wanted to buy me a birthday gift, just put me in a bookstore, right? I've kind of been that girl pretty much from the beginning of my life. Um, and then when I thought about like my career after graduating college, I was always in the nonprofit world. So I started as an assistant at the Brennan Center, a public policy think tank. And I kind of, I was there for actually a long time. Most of my career, when I talk about it, I spent almost a decade at the Brennan Center. And I feel like that was my boot camp for nonprofit work and what that means. And you know, the Brennan Center is a public policy think tank. The issues that they work on are very wonky, very kind of technical, but I was on the communications team, helming the public programming and the events there. And so I was always thinking about how do you take this work and make it accessible to a larger audience? And at the end of the day, I mean, that's storytelling, right? That's,
Yes.
there's no other way except for storytelling that like campaign finance reform becomes accessible to a wider audience. So I was always organizing book talks and really thinking about how books and stories and narratives can help further a larger cause, whatever that is. Um, the idea, though, of being involved in kind of literature while at work, I didn't even kind of know it was possible until I joined Penn on the development team, organizing the gala and other fundraising events for the donors. It was the first time that it was like what I loved to do in my spare time and what I was doing at work merged into one, kind of really wonderful experience. So I do think in a really kind of serendipitous way, um, everything that I did leading up to joining the workshop really prepared me in different ways. And I had always been a fan of the workshop. I'd always attended the events.
Mm.
It was a community that I was very familiar with and aware of. I actually, when I was at the Brennan Center, we partnered with the workshop on different events, specifically with our liberty and national security team and the work that they do. So um, it felt like coming home in a lot of ways, but it also was obviously something new and exciting, my first time actually leading an organization. So it's been just as much of a learning experience as it has been a homecoming.
Yeah, I can see that because when you talk about homecoming, I mean, that feels somehow what I felt when I walked into that space in AWW. I think that was in 2013 when I first moved to New York City. And it was such a relief to be in that space just because I had moved to New York thinking that I was going to this place to be this writer. There were so many writers, there were so many institutions, and I thought that's how you find community. But then when I actually came here, I found that in most of the places I was the only person of color there. I'm like, what? What? How did that happen? I thought New York City was this very integrated city, And so I was like so happy to walk into AAWW. Um, and I also, I think, attended a publishing conference there. This was, I think, 2014, and the Page Turner. You had another conference this year in 2021. Like, what went into your thinking for what issues you were dealing with this year? Because when I went in, it was I was so happy to actually hear publicly stated at the conference how difficult it is for people of color to get published. And has things changed since 2014? Has How do you see it?
Yeah, I love how you describe your experience with the workshop. That's such a big part of what prompted its founding, right? The founders wanted that space of their own, and it's what motivated them to kind of create the organization. And so the fact that it's still doing that for people decades later, I think, is just a testament to their vision and what they had in mind. The publishing conference, the workshop has had a couple of different signature events in the past over the course of its history. The publishing conference being one of them. Page Turner was originally a literary festival, so it was actually kind of two different events: a literary festival and a publishing conference. Both had been in a little bit of a hiatus the past few years, especially with all of the transition. And so I knew when I was appointed in this role, one of the first things that I really wanted to think about was how to bring back some of those flagship events, and revitalize them. And so we merged them in a little bit. We took the name of the literary festival and we took the framework of the publishing conference, and we put the two of them together. And the result was this year's Page Turner Publishing Conference, which we went back and forth over, do we do this virtually? It was still the spring, indoor gathering still wasn't really happening. But we decided to go big, do a big thing online. And the feedback we got, I think people were really thrilled, and we were excited to host the types of conversations that we did host. When we were thinking about what we wanted to do with the conference, I had a couple of ideas and kind of goals in mind. The first was really to expand the definition of what we think about when we think about writing and publishing. Traditionally, the publishing conference was very literary publishing focused, editors, agents, that piece of the industry, which is still obviously a very important focus. But we also added panels on screenwriting and translation and cultural criticism and academic work. One thing that I've always admired most about the workshop is just how diverse our audience of writers really is. Mm-hmm. And we're thinking constantly about how to expand that definition of what it means to be a writer as much as possible. And that was one thing that I wanted to definitely, really centralize with the conference. I think it was also really interesting for us to bring back the conference this year. There's been this kind of upheaval in the publishing industry. There have been a lot of really key critical appointments of senior editors and people with power now in that world, that didn't exist before. And I think about the editorial panel that we did, that we called the New Editorial Vanguard, really taking stock of the moment we're in, because, you asked if we're in a different place than we were in 2014. And I think in a lot of ways we are. And I also think we're at the beginning of what that difference actually is going to be. A lot of these people have just come into these roles in the past 6 months to a year. I think the fruits of their labor are still yet to be realized. So I'm really excited for the future of publishing, that, some of those speakers that we were privileged to feature are going to really lead the way on. And I just think it's such a really important conference, not just for the information it provides. I think we were really conscious about making sure that the conversations we were putting together were not only useful, but also different. There are lots of publishing conferences. What are we saying? What are we putting out there that isn't being talked about in other places for whatever reason. But also that sense of building community, we wanted to make sure that was central too, in terms of making people feel like, even virtually, even online, that they were conspiring together, that this was a day that we were spending together, even from our own homes, and just like catching up and hearing from people that they might not have otherwise heard of. And we had, I think, over 200 people, which for a Saturday over the summer, for 200 people to sign up for an online event, I feel like is a big success. We were really thrilled. And we've, been able to record the conversations and make use of the conversations even after the actual live event, which has also been kind of like a nice advantage of the whole virtual thing.
No, that last thing is great because I can actually go back and see all the panels that I missed. I was very lucky to be on one of the panels at the conference, Writing in the Pandemic. And one thing that I think one of my fellow panelists said, I think Tamiko Bale, was how to rethink publishing or getting the book out or the word out. And she talked about this notion of abundance rather than thinking of scarcity, the abundance model. And what you are talking about, how you wanted to expand in this conference, what publishing is about, and how to bring in more people into the conversation, not just the agents and the publishers. I think that speaks to that kind of, because how else do we create abundance?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is like trying to figure out how to make this kind of writing be accessible to more people. And I think following up on that, it seems like that is what you're also doing online in other ways, like through your website. Your website, I have to say that every time I go back, I am so excited to find somebody new there. It's like, where are these writers, and how is this amazing stuff slowly coming up, and how is AAWW discovering them? It seems to me like what you're doing is some kind of gate opening, and that I find absolutely thrilling. How does AAWW see yourself? How do you go about discovering these talent?
I love that idea of gate opening. I'm going to steal that from you because I don't think we've ever thought of our work in that way, but it is something that we do, subconsciously and intentionally, both. I think it starts with what undergirds our idea of community more than anything is that everyone is welcome. I talked about expanding the definition of what it means to be a writer. We also think a lot at the workshop about expanding the definition of what it means to be Asian and Asian American. It's a complicated term, and we try to we operate from a really radically inclusive ethos of what it means to be Asian, what it means to be Asian American. And part and parcel of that is the idea that readers and writers at all stages of the career are welcomed. And I do think we're one of the only organizations that really engages with writers at every single stage of their career. And writers, we have baby writers that come to our workshops or come to our events and maybe are just thinking about what it even means to be a writer, or just listening to writers that they, are inspired by and admire. Our magazine, you mentioned the website, our calls for submissions are open, and that's intentional. It's a way to hear from writers we might not know about, either in New York City or in other parts of the country and or world. And so we very intentionally thinking about bringing as many people as we can in early and often. And so the result of that is when there are those writers who do get published or who do become one of our fellows, we think every writer we work with is brilliant. We're a little biased, but when they write their best-selling novel and when they win their awards, we're really honored and privileged to have been a part of their experience when they were first starting and their formative years as a writer. And it's a responsibility that we think about often, we take very seriously. And I think it's just rooted again in what we think of when we think of community, and how we incorporate that feeling and that sense of community in literally everything that we do.
I just remembered that when you talked about beginning writers and how you support them, that you also have these fellowships that bring people in, and then you not these fellowships are actually more than just fellowships; they're a kind of mentorships. So,
Yeah.
how do you go about selecting your fellows, and who is doing the mentoring? How is this?
Yeah, our fellowships are really wonderful because we really think about ways that we are, materially supporting each of our fellows. We want to change their lives during the year that they are with us, and we try to do that each and every year. The selection process is rigorous. There's multiple rounds of reading. We think a lot about it, the work that they are submitting it really drives that process, and we try to let the work speak for itself more than anything else. And so when you're thinking about criteria for selection, we definitely emphasize the submitted work. We want that to kind of set the standard for our fellows. But when we think about guest speakers, they have monthly meetings. We're always, we don't have like a curriculum in a box for our fellowships. And that's intentional because I really believe that every fellowship cohort is unique. Every fellowship cohort has its own needs. Our Margins Fellowship, for example, this year, the Margins Fellowship is the one that focuses on writers who are working on a book-length piece of work. We have a majority of poets this year, and that's just kind of how the cohort turned out. So a group of mostly poets are going to have different needs than a group of maybe, I don't know, writers working on like fiction novels, right? And so we very deliberately for each cohort developed the programming to suit their needs and what they're looking for. And I think part of that is listening to the fellows, but part of it is also a lot of times, especially young writers, they don't know what to ask for. So
Yes.
it's us thinking about, our contacts, our industry connections, and what can we do. This past year, for example, and this kind of goes back to, your previous question about the publishing conference and how things have changed. A person who was appointed recently as a senior editor at one of the big 5 publishing houses reached out to us and said, I'm in this role now. I have the ability to really help emerging writers. So we connected and we thought about ways that we could work together, and what could we do to connect our fellows or other emerging writers that we might be connected to editors, decision makers, publishers at one of the big 5 houses. And where we landed was a really special kind of intimate pitch session for just our fellows. And they were able to meet with, I think, over 20 different senior editors, VPs. There was such interest from the publishing house to even meet with our fellows, right? And so when you have somebody in power, when you have somebody who's making those decisions, who's thinking about communities like ours, who's thinking about writers that we know, I really do think game-changing things can happen, and it can really just change kind of how the publishing industry works. And it's like a small way of disrupting what has otherwise been a traditionally very opaque industry.
I mean, that's amazing, because a lot of times it feels like publishing is about who you know, and when you are in the marginalized communities, you don't know anybody in publishing. And that session sounds like such a wonderful gift both to the community and to the fellows. One thing I noticed that you did with the fellows recently, and I may be wrong, but I think it's correct, you dropped the age requirement for the fellowships.
Yep. So one of our fellowships originally, and this was, again, kind of a relic of philanthropy and donor requirements. It capped, I think that it was 35 was, the cap for an emerging writer. And because of changes in our funding sources, we were able to remove that cap, which again, I think is a game changer. Anybody can be an emerging writer. It's at any point in their life, and it's something that we are thrilled to have been able to do, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to do in future years. But yeah,
No.
emerging doesn't have to mean young. We certainly don't think so.
Yes, because I remember I when I came here, I was like, I can't apply to this because I was like already past 40, and I was like, no, this does not. And I felt a little sad about that. Because these days there is, I mean, youth, of course, I mean, we have this talent that we want to do, which is to bring up the next generation of writers as well. But there are others of us who come to writing through the circuitous route that puts us beyond the youthful stage. Um, One thing that, going back to your website, that I wanted to talk to you about, I think, was just how your projects are going beyond what you would think as your mission of serving like Asian American writers is what your mission says. But I saw this fascinating project and been reading through so many of them, like this TransPacific Literary Project. Um, One particular article that shouted out to me was this conversation called Queer Time, in which is an interview. I think it's called "Striking a Pose in Taiwan: The Past and Future of Queer Speculation." And there's this incredible conversation between these two Taiwanese writers, Sin Hui and Ta Wei. And Tai Wei at one point says, we naturally presumed our queer futures would be like what they were in the West instead of in the rest, like Taiwan. And that it took them many years to realize that they should reconceptualize queer literature in their homeland. And Sin Hui responds with, queerness should also challenge the presumption of a positive and successful life. What the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think, in a way, what AAWW is trying to do and is to reconceptualize what is our literatures and what is literatures of the Americas. Like, what is the literature here? And so far, we have been handed down the canon of the white canon. And so it sounds like such an exciting way, because I think it allows us to look at possibilities that are beyond what is happening in the country itself, to see like how are other countries dealing with this. What is AWW's take on this? Why did you start this particular project, and how do you see it in the grand challenge of reconceptualizing?
Yeah, so it's the Trans-Pacific Literary Project. Is our kind of primary translation project focused on works in Southeast Asia. It's been around for a few years, and we publish these, quarterly notebooks that we call them, which are clusters of work around a certain theme. Um, One thing that we changed since I was appointed was, a problem that we had in the past was we weren't getting a lot of submissions from the countries in Asia themselves. So even for translation projects, our submissions were primarily either writers or translators in America. And to kind of confront that challenge, we formed an advisory team made up of editors and translators actually in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Taiwan. And so every call that we now do for TLP is translated and publicized in the home countries as well. And even in just kind of the one or two notebooks of work that we've done since then, we've already seen an exponential number of submissions from outside of America, which is exactly what we wanted to spark. And we're thrilled that we're starting to do that. Geographically, we focus a lot. This project focuses in Southeast Asia. I'm really interested in expanding it. Again, I think there's a treasure trove of literature and work to be translated, from kind of all parts of Asia. Again, rethinking like what does a classical canon even look like, right? And I think translating works from Asia is a big piece of, if we want to redefine the canon, I think we need to look to our own histories, our own classics, of which there are plenty, right? I mean, you could do a whole curriculum on just like classic Bengali texts, right? Like it's there. And I think, what the world is doing to make them more accessible is really important. And whatever way we can support that larger effort, I definitely want us to be a part of. I'm really excited by translation just in general. You know, English departments at academic institutions these days are dwindling for a lot of reasons. The way the world is, the way English departments in a lot of ways are going the ways of what are now kind of classical departments. And I think one possibility for real innovation in academia in the English departments is really like drilling into translation a little bit. And what role does that play in rethinking what the canon looks like, and having this kind of new line of work and areas to focus on and study. So that's in a much kind of broader sense from what we're doing at the workshop, but it's something I'm personally really excited by. And it's something we hope to bring more of in our own way, whether it's other translated pieces in the magazine or just like events featuring translators. I just think it's really fascinating work, and it's definitely an area that we want to grow and expand in the future.
One thing I noticed about the website and these translation projects is that you actually include the original pieces. So you don't really just see the translated pieces, you actually see the original pieces. And there was this article, I think, The Pot of Rice, that came out recently. That was like amazing to see not just one piece translated, but translated by, as you say, by all these various voices and different things that they pick up. And I think that is the conversation that we rarely have. Like, how can there be so much meaning that when otherwise you have these classical works that seem to just get stultified? Yeah, this is the meaning of this piece. Yeah.
Right. I mean, who is doing the translating is just as important of a question as what is being translated, which is exactly why what we were trying to explore with the piece that you mentioned. And translation is more than just words from one language to another. I think it's a political conversation, it's a social conversation, and that's one that we're definitely hoping to have more of.
Great. I thought I would talk about one other prong of your arsenal, which is the events that you do. A disclaimer, I mean, not a disclaimer to you, but to the audience, that you hosted the launch of my novel, which was a dream come true for me. I was incredibly thrilled when your email landed in my inbox suggesting AAWW as an opportunity for launching my novel, because I have been in your space and attended so many launches of friends and mentors, and it felt like a homecoming. Again, that word there. Another event I think that and felt I was so incredibly moved by was this um, um, this gathering of Asian women writers whom you got together in this aftermath of the horrific murders in Atlanta earlier this year. There was to see so much brilliance and passion and emotion in one event with the community gathering in solidarity, especially during the isolation brought about by COVID. I was like beyond moved, and also not just moved, I was like, so much. Where are these writers, and how do I get to hear their voices and their poetry and their prose? Where should I go find them? And so um, it was, I think, an eye-opening event for me, just as to what is possible in this new space. Can you talk about how AAWW is thinking about event programming in this current climate where we have all this hostility, polarization, isolation going on?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I should use this opportunity to give a much well deserved shout out to our programs team, led by Lily Philpott, who I know a lot of people in our audience virtually have met over the past year. Um, they do a fantastic job of just curation and thinking about lineups each season. Um, and so, first and foremost, kudos to them. I have an events background. It's always something that I think about. Um, More than anything, I knew that when we had to make this move to virtual events, um, I didn't want to just take what would happen in person and kind of plop it on Zoom, because I don't think that's how you create that feeling of community in the virtual space. Um, you almost need to think about digital events as an entirely different entity. And that was part of our learning process, right? We all kind of collectively went through this learning curve in the past 18 months or so of like, how do we do this on the computer? How do we, like, everything from the technical, like how do we turn our cameras on, to the more figurative of, okay, how do we make people feel the same way that they feel when they're in our space in Chelsea? Um, so first and foremost, I think being very deliberate about what we're doing online, and not just kind of thinking that in person easily translates to digital, because I don't think it does. Um, I think also, people are looking for ways to connect with each other. And so we've actually seen our audience numbers go up in the past year, which has been
Mm.
um, really wonderful and kind of affirming for us. Um, I think, but before we started, we were talking about how with these virtual events, um, they end pretty abruptly, right? Everyone kind of stops talking, and then like you turn your computer off and it's over. Um, we thought about ways to transfer that experience of like the post-event mingle that often happens when people are just milling about and have the chance to have their book signed, or even meet the authors that were speaking. And so one small thing that we've done is um, leave the Zoom chat open for about 10-15 minutes after the conversation has formally ended. And so anybody who has tuned in, like, that's their moment to maybe ask another question, or connect with um, other audience members. There was one event that we did where um, a group of young women were in attendance, and they were all doing their like undergraduate thesis work on, I think Asian American literature, or maybe the book that was in question. I can't remember the specific event. These are people that have never met. They're meeting for the first time in a Zoom chat room, realizing they have academic work that aligns, and then making plans to meet offline.
Wow.
Which is the kind of thing that would have definitely happened if they were there in person. It's the kind of thing that um, we try to organically help make happen with our events. But to see it still happening online was just really heartwarming, and kind of like um, affirming for us and our team. Um, and again, I talk about community a lot, and I feel like I say the word a lot, and it is a buzzword in a lot of ways, but it is so crucial and core to our work. And I think it's most exemplified in our events. And it's driven, our strategy for even in the digital world. Like, even if we're on Zoom, what are we doing to foster that sense of community? And no matter, whether we're home or whether we're in person, that's always going to drive what we do. And I think it shows in the types of events that we're doing, and the types of conversations that we're being able to host.
I have to admit that thing, keeping the thing open, is a master stroke. Because usually, even as a thing, you're like, suddenly somebody says event over, and then you're like, what? But I'm still here. I'm still here physically and mentally, at least mentally and emotionally, I'm still there. So it was definitely wonderful to have that space. And I'm also thrilled by what you said about this group meeting, and then being able to take it offline, because I think it may not have even been possible in a real space. because conversations sometimes are happening in different parts and you can't be privy to everything that's going on there. So I think that part is
Totally. That's the other thing, the chat, I think, if used intentionally and kind of deliberately, it's a parallel conversation. And normally, if you're in an in-person event and you're listening to someone speak, it's silent, right? Because
Mhm.
otherwise, it's rude, right? But because we're online, because it's this virtual world, there's an entirely separate parallel conversation happening. And I think you're right. Actually, those girls probably wouldn't have connected in person because they wouldn't have like typed out what they were working on. You know what I mean? It wouldn't have happened. So I look for silver linings when I can. And I do think we've gotten just really wonderful, beautiful feedback from our events. And I think they have served a really important purpose and have been a real comfort and a balm for people the way, good literature really should be. Um, and we're honored to have been able to in our own kind of small part, um, foster that those moments of community for people.
Are there any other events that you're looking in the future that you're looking to forward to, Jafreen?
So we are launching our fall season this month. And by the time this airs, it will have been launched. And so you all will see what's coming up, which we're very excited about. One thing that we are doing this season is it's our 30th anniversary.
Ooh.
And so, in addition to our kind of regular seasonal lineup, we're having a parallel series of events kind of run in line with it called AAWW at 30. And we're, retrospectives can be hard because it's like obviously focusing on our past is important and it's something that we're going to do. But for our retrospective, we want the focus to not just be on the past, but also, what is coming up in the future for the next 30 years. And so we have really exciting events planned, focusing on things like Muslim representation in Hollywood and what that looks like now, how that's changed, especially because this year is also the 20th anniversary of 9/11, how that's, impacted
Mm.
what that looks like, what that means. We're working on an event. We've used the word homecoming a few times. We're working on an event focused on the idea of home and what it means to create a cultural and artistic home, which is so kind of central to our mission. Um, we're working on an event featuring past and current editors and thinking about what our editorial legacy is and what we hope to do editorially moving forward. So we're really excited. I think it's going to be a really great way to celebrate and be proud of the past 30 years, but also, as we always do, think about what's coming up and where do we go from here.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing, amazing season. Um, the one, I mean, one of the some of those articles that I've been particularly drawn to recently um, are, I think I read this article about a Muslim chaplain
Mm.
working at a hospital, and that was like so uh, heartwarming to read because those are not the kind of stories that we usually read anywhere. So, Jeffreen, um, apart from all this wonderful work that the Writers Workshop is doing about creating and publishing and developing and disseminating creative writing by Asian Americans, you also have this other part of the mission, which is to provide an alternative literary art space at the intersection of migration, race, and social justice. And I think, in a way, and what we've been talking about, this community and this inclusion and this abundance and all these other things that we're talking about is undergirds everything that AAWW is doing. It and positions AAWW as an agent for change. Um, you also have these other projects that I noticed on your website, like A World Without Cages, Create Now, Black and Asian solidarities, and all these seem to be part of that same fabric. Um, uh, and what inspires me is that there's this vision that you're talking about, which is for the next, not just for the past 30, but for the future, about what writers and writing can do to bring about change collectively. Because as individual writers, I think sometimes we feel like what we're doing is too little, too little, maybe too late. But what you have now is a vision for, like, you seem to have like a vision for the next 30 years. Can you speak about these other projects that you're...
Absolutely. I mean, I think, art and literature, it's all political, right? It's all part of, you know, what it means when your identity is kind of intrinsically tied to these histories of political violence, of generational trauma. That is a part of our community's identity, our community's stories. And I don't necessarily mean that, every piece of Asian or Asian diasporic literature needs to speak to war and imperialism or,
Right.
that certainly not. I think the most beautiful pieces and the stuff that I'm most drawn to are the ones that are rooted in joy and like a good romance story, but
Yes, of course.
even those, for a community like ours, joy and like a romance novel is subversive, right? Because you are put in this bucket where people expect you to almost be defined by your identity in a way that quite honestly just doesn't happen for white people. And so because of that, I don't think it's possible to amplify Asian and Asian diasporic storytelling without just understanding that core part of our community's identity, history, how we operate. And so it's a natural thing. I don't think there's a way to authentically do what we do without acknowledging that fact. And so if we're doing our work well, that just comes with the territory. And it's something that we do think about. We obviously are amplifying storytelling and amplifying work by our community of writers, all to really mobilize our community of readers and writers in advocating for a more just and equitable future, whatever that means. And that doesn't mean everybody needs to be an activist in the streets. I don't think that's true. But
Yes.
Acknowledging our histories and paying homage to our traditions, that's as revolutionary an act as being out on the streets and protesting, in my opinion. And so it's something that we think about. I think it also informs a lot of our work. The Asian American community is a young one. The term itself is relative. It's only a few decades old. So we're kind of still in that infant stage of like what it means to be this block of people in America or even in the world. And so it's that kind of because of that, like, of course we're tied to our histories. You can't not be, because it's still such a young history.
Very young. I mean, I myself can only talk about this term in like 10 years. I mean, until 10 years ago, I was an Indian, and that's how I considered myself. And then, like, Indian American, to even take on that term is something I'm still new to. And so to think of when I think of my own place in this country and as a writer, and also in the hopes of what you're talking about, we don't all have to be marching in the streets, but I still feel like you're called to do something, which is why so many of us become writers. So a question for you, Jafreen, that's how do we as writers get involved and give back to institutions like AAWW who are doing all this other work for change?
Say yes to our invitations when we email you. That would be kind of first and foremost. I think, being just a part of our community. I mean, we have writers who when you think about the kind of the Venn diagrams of your various audiences for any organization, for a lot of organizations, and this is like the nonprofit management geek coming out in me, but for most organizations, your audiences are very kind of distinct, concrete buckets, right? Your donors are here, your audience members are here, your kind of inner circle stakeholders are here. We, and this is, again, just a testament to how really beautiful and kind of strong our community is connected. Um, Everybody intersects in so many different ways. We have writers who are donors. We have writers who are advisors. We have writers who come to our events. I think I emailed you after I saw your name in the attendee list of an event, and I wanted to reach out and say hi, right? And so when you think about like giving back to an organization like ours, it's really more concrete than just like, actually giving anything. Would be, continuing to be a part of the community that so many of our writer friends have found so valuable. And I talked a little bit before about, that full circle where we do engage with writers at every stage of their career. The more seasoned writers, the ones who were with us as baby writers kind of a decade or two ago and are now, prolific writers, they're the ones that are acting as mentors. They're the ones who are giving back to the new generation of emerging writers. And by them doing that, they are effectively giving back to us, because that's the ecosystem that we're trying to create and that we're trying to cultivate. We did a clinic recently, a special writing clinic for community organizers. And it was a chance to teach a group of community organizers who might not be traditional writers, ways to use storytelling and narrative techniques in processing so much of the work that they've been doing the past year. We had representatives from every mutual aid organization. We had representatives from CAV, Drum, really every kind of community organization in the area. It was a really kind of wonderful cohort of people. And we realized throughout the course of this 6-week workshop, there were multiple former interns. There were multiple people who knew other interns. The instructor, Lisa Coe, was also a former intern. So it's, that ecosystem that where somebody comes in as a baby writer and then turns into a mentor a couple of decades later, that's so central to everything that we do. And if when I think of ways for writers to get involved and give back to the workshop, just be a part of that community, because that's what drives us, and it's what keeps our work going.
And the work is sometimes hard, but I'm so glad that AAWW is there to help us along the way. I also wanted to, I am really grateful to AAWW for just being there all these years. As I said, I called it a beacon, which is how I feel it is. The work is hard. I mean, the pandemic has made it so much harder. And you started your as ED when the pandemic started as well. So I thought I would end by checking in with you. Like, how are you doing right now? How is AAWW doing? How are the staff doing? How are you taking care of yourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I started at the end of January. We were in the office in person for a month, the shortest month of the year, February. And then starting in March, we all went remote. So when I think about my transition, I didn't really have one. Like it was almost like starting new instead of transitioning into something. And so it definitely was not the transition I imagined. How am I? I am doing good. I mean, as an organization, we were very lucky. We didn't, have to lay anybody off. We were able to, also, I think, to our credit, we were able to pivot digitally fairly quickly. And I think it's actually even before the pandemic, all of our events were already being posted on YouTube. Um, Pre-pandemic, we as an organization were always thinking about how do we take what's happening in our little space in New York City and bring it out to the rest of the world. Which is why we have the YouTube channel, and we would record and then upload every event that happened in our little space in New York. What the pandemic did was actually just force the rest of the world to think about the same questions we had already been thinking about for years. So in a lot of ways, programmatically, I feel like we did have a little bit of a leg up on a lot of organizations because between the digital magazine and then our kind of our YouTube channel, we were prepared technically, I think, in a way that other organizations needed to play catch up a little bit. And it's part of the reason we were able to really successfully think about what an online programs model looks like. Even our community workshops, where we bring teaching artists to high schools and senior centers throughout New York City, even those were converted to Zoom meetings. Wow. And we thought a lot about, just because we're not gathering in person, our community is still there. So how do we reach them? And so being able to be that source of comfort for our community, I think, has translated into a source of comfort also for our staff. And again, it's a responsibility that we continue to take seriously. I also, we take breaks. We are all very tired. And so, just as an example, we had a summer break where we closed the office the last week of August, right before Labor Day, and had kind of like an extended, complete office closure. Because I do personally believe that those types of breaks and space for yourself and your mental well-being are really important. So when I think about just kind of like office culture and what employees need, along with innovative work, I think giving people that space to really process everything that's happened in the past 18 months is really important. And it's something that I think about often, of making sure that the staff is okay and knows to take the time that they need. It's been a really hard year for a lot of people. And so if we want to be the source of comfort and care for our community, we can't do that if we're not okay ourselves. And so when I think about, what to do for the employees and how to support them, that's definitely a primary focus of mine personally. And it's one that kind of continues to drive how I lead the staff and manage them.
Yep. And I'm so glad to hear that, because the work you're doing is so important, especially now, I think, with the country getting into an even more kind of unstable state. Let me just put it mildly. Jafreen, this was such an amazing conversation, and thank you for this opportunity to be able to ask you these questions. I'm so thrilled that Lily reached out to me to do this, and thank you.
The pleasure was all mine, Nawaz. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody tuning in.